Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wheat. I'm the Wildlife Connectivity Coordinator at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work here in our conservation program. The work that I do deals only with terrestrial wildlife. We have a separate fish division that deals with fish passage issues, so what we're talking about today is all about terrestrial wildlife connectivity, but we do hope to ultimately combine efforts with our fish division. Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi there. My name is Tom Ewald. I'm a conservation planner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm with the Science Applications Program and located out of the Portland Regional Office.
And Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Bliss Ketchum. I'm a PhD candidate at Portland State University and co-owner of the Samara Group. I've been involved with Metro Regional Habitat Connectivity work and a lot of this great statewide work that you'll hear more about today.
Yeah, so as discussed in the email, we're going through a species selection process for connectivity mapping in Oregon's Coast Range ecoregion. So today we're going to start by giving some background on our statewide connectivity assessment project and why we need your help. We're going to discuss a little bit about how our statewide work ties in with the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative's Landscape Conservation Design Project, which is kind of happening simultaneously with the statewide effort. And we're going to go through the steps that we've taken thus far in developing a species candidate list. And then we'll talk about the scoring process that we'll ask you to participate in and have some time for questions at the end. This right here is the Oregon Wildlife Linkage Priorities map. It is ODFW's only connectivity map to date. As you can see here, there are some warmer colors on the map, the reds and the oranges. Those are essentially representative of areas where we expect greater wildlife mortalities on Oregon's major highways, and the green areas are areas where we expect fewer mortalities. And these efforts are largely based on just ODOT's roadkill data and expert opinion. There was a series of workshops that were completed through ODFW in 2007, gathering together species biologists and experts, and essentially hand drawing out on maps areas where they felt that species connectivity might be impeded. And that's thus far been proven to be insufficient in making decisions related to promoting or enhancing wildlife connectivity across the landscape. And as you can see based on this map, this is just restricted to Oregon's major highways, but we have so many other instances where we need good connectivity information: habitat conservation and restoration, strategic conservation investment, siting for land use change and development, urban growth boundaries. There's a whole host of problems out there for which we need good wildlife connectivity information that we just don't have. And fortunately, in the last few years, there's been wild improvements in the availability and resolution of spatial data and new and more robust statistical modeling techniques that have really made fine resolution landscape scale connectivity modeling feasible. And so we're hoping to apply that in the state of Oregon to update some of these products. In 2016, we did an update to Oregon's State Wildlife Action Plan, which we call the Oregon Conservation Strategy. Each state in the United States has a State Wildlife Action Plan. That's the overarching state strategy for conserving Oregon's fish and wildlife species. And as part of the 2016 update to the Oregon Conservation Strategy, we identified 7 key conservation issues. And one of those 7 key conservation issues is barriers to animal movement. Wildlife connectivity issues are also vital components of 3 additional key conservation issues, including climate change, land use changes, and water quality and quantity. Also in 2016, we had the formation of the Oregon Habitat Connectivity Consortium, and you can see here the logo is representative of the current steering committee for that group. The OHCC was formed in 2016 to promote functional natural landscape connectivity and to mitigate barriers to wildlife movement at multiple scales throughout Oregon and the surrounding region. Our steering committee meets monthly to talk about different connectivity issues in Oregon, and we have worked collaboratively over the past year to produce an implementation plan for essentially completing the statewide connectivity assessment and mapping project, drawing on current best practices in landscape scale connectivity modeling. So between the updates to the Oregon Conservation Strategy and the formation of the Oregon Habitat Connectivity Consortium, the need for this statewide connectivity assessment has been made apparent, and our approach with this assessment is to fill critical knowledge gaps by completing connectivity assessment and mapping at fine resolutions across the state of Oregon, to conduct extensive outreach to encourage a diverse group of partners to utilize and implement the results from the assessment, and to make sure that all of the data and results from our analyses are easy to find, view, and understand. just briefly go through the steps for our statewide analysis. Most of what we're going to be talking about here today is the species selection process. We are planning on selecting species on an ecoregion by ecoregion basis, but we'll map species across their range. We're looking to represent diverse habitat needs, life history strategies, and dispersal capabilities of Oregon's terrestrial wildlife. And of course, as mentioned today, we're going to be starting with selecting species for Oregon's Coast Range ecoregion. The second step, once we have species to represent connectivity in each ecoregion, we will do model building and validation. We're planning on using resistant surface-based connectivity modeling, primarily with CircuitScape and Omniscape, which are applications of circuit theory. And, I mean, in brief, we're going to be developing species-specific habitat models, which are then used to build a landscape resistance layer. And then we essentially treat animal movement as the flow of current from source to ground pixels that are based on that landscape resistance. We need to go through some prioritization after those models are produced. The output of a current flow model, like a model using CircuitScape or Omniscape, is essentially a variety of pathways on the landscape that highlight areas where movement is facilitated or bottlenecked or impeded for different wildlife species. And we actually need to go through and identify which of those pathways are the primary targets for conservation action. We'll be producing maps for species individually, but it's also important to look at the suite of species across the state as a whole. If we want to invest conservation dollars and maximize our investment, we need to be looking at areas where connectivity is being impacted for multiple species rather than just a single target species. So we'll do some composition of maps. In terms of outreach and engagement, that's something that's kind of going along the entire process here. We want to ensure that our products are reaching practitioners and that interested parties feel that they're engaged in and are participating in as much as possible the development process. And then finally, product distribution. So once we produce these connectivity maps, we need to make sure that they're very easily accessible, that they're easy to understand, and that they get into the hands of folks that are out sort of working on the ground on these different projects. So I mentioned earlier that our sort of statewide process ties in quite nicely to the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative Landscape Conservation Design Project, and Tom is going to speak a little bit on that project.
Right. Thanks a lot, Rachel. Yeah, thank you. I just want a quick check here. I got a question from Tal Levi, or Levi Tal, that if you can hear the audio okay. So I'm just checking. Can folks hear the audio?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yep, sounds good here.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks, Rachel, and I'll just go through this really quickly, and it's been great to partner with ODFW and the Oregon Habitat Connectivity Consortium. So back in 2016, the North Pacific LCC, which was then funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, started a project called the Landscape Conservation Design in the coastal ecoregion that covers the Pacific Temperate Rainforest region. And in our initial outreach to both states in this region, we found that habitat connectivity was an issue both in Washington and in Oregon, and there were issues that wanted to be tackled. And so in thinking about landscape scale conservation, the habitat connectivity fits in really nicely with the project, and we started working with both states on a plan for a connectivity assessment across the region. So it's been great to partner with ODF&W and the group on this. The vision of this project is to achieve a network of healthy, connected ecosystems and working landscapes capable of providing a full suite of ecosystem services that can respond and adapt to change and other key stressors through the use of collaborative science-based strategies. So there's a few key goals. One is to foster a spirit of collaboration and communication, understand climate impacts, and then there's really two key goals of this project that are our network of people, which you'll see some logos later that get to the key stakeholders in this, is to identify a diverse suite of intact, connected, functioning ecosystems and to create science-based, spatially explicit products that identify priority places. So there's a lot of need for this kind of assessment in this landscape, and we're going to work with ODF&W and learn from your species expertise on what species we should be mapping. Next slide. So the overall kind of vision of this project is that if our outcome is connected landscapes for fish and wildlife, that it's really going to take multiple partners working together in some sort of coordinated way, or at least, communicating regularly about their role in the landscape. And this diagram just shows that, developing and getting towards an outcome of connected landscape won't happen overnight. It'll likely happen over many, many years. So what are intermediate outcomes that different organizations like the Fish and Wildlife Service, Land Trusts, Forest Service, different counties, and state agencies and working lands, and what role can they play in implementing a connected landscape? So in order to get to that outcome, we need maps showing what are the right places. Where can we do conservation in the right places for the right species? Next slide. So here's a key. Here's the slide I was telling you about the key partners that have played key roles in this. These are the members of the leadership team that help drive and think through progress on this project and next steps. And so we meet regularly, and these are the key folks that have been plotting the future of this effort. Next slide. And it's a real mixed group of tribes, NGOs, state and federal agencies. And last week we had a great meeting in Chehalis, Washington, with small and large landowners of in the forest industry, and thinking through what makes a sustainable landscape in Southwest Washington. And we hope to have similar discussions and dialogue in Oregon as well. So next steps, we're doing a similar assessment up in Washington. We're going to continue to work with the Oregon group. We have 2 or 3 scenario planning workshops on the horizon. We're actively reaching out to private lands and their role in habitat connectivity in this forested ecoregion of the Pacific Northwest coast is incredibly important, as we have a lot of core areas on federal or state lands, and there's a lot of land in between that if we can work with our private land partners, we can achieve that outcome of connected landscapes. We want to do a synthesis of conservation actions and priorities, and then we're going to work with open standards. So those are there's a website down there too, so feel free to peruse that and learn more about our project, and I'll hand it back over to Rachel, and look forward to hearing how what species you all think through on this effort. Thank you.
All right, great. So getting into the nitty-gritty here, species selection is what we're here to discuss today. As I mentioned before, we're selecting species based on an ecoregional basis, but each species will be mapped across their respective range within the state. We're looking to represent a diversity of habitat associations, life history strategies, dispersal capabilities, a range of taxa. So we'll be holding workshops like this one in each ecoregion to source the expertise of local biologists and practitioners to decide which species are the best candidates for connectivity mapping in that ecoregion. I just want to mention here that our species selection process that we've developed draws on work completed by the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group during their species selection process that they did for their statewide connectivity assessment effort and their Columbia Plateau connectivity effort project assessments, and also processes developed in the creation of the Regional Habitat Connectivity Toolkit in the Portland metro region. So when we select species for these efforts, it's obviously infeasible to model connectivity for all species, so we need to pick a suite of species that are representative of the whole. Common approaches for species selection often rely on umbrella species. So these are area-demanding species that are typically large-bodied, highly mobile general species that have low sensitivity to barriers and habitat types. Some projects then do fill in the gaps or attempt to fill in the gaps by identifying what might be missing. But recent research has suggested that this classical umbrella species approach is somewhat unreliable, and that a surrogate species selection based on diverse habitat needs are the most effective. That's kind of what we're doing here with our effort. We go through this process that we're calling goal-oriented surrogate species selection. So essentially we're trying to start the process with the end goal in mind and think about what do we intend our surrogate species to represent, both as individual species and as a group of species. So for the Coast Range ecoregion and for most ecoregions, we're wanting to represent a diversity of habitat types. We're wanting to represent specific habitat structural characteristics that are important to that ecoregion. In the Coast Range, we've identified seral stages, so early, medium, and late seral stages as being important habitat structural characteristics, as well as a linkage between aquatic and terrestrial habitats. We want to represent a diversity of taxa, so we want a range of mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles. We want to represent a diversity of movement capabilities and dispersal capabilities, a diversity of susceptibility to barriers, and a diversity of threats to species persistence. So the steps that we've gone through in the species selection process, and will continue to go through as we move this effort forward. Our first step here was to do a hierarchical clustering of the species habitat associations. So we started out with all of the habitat types in the Coast Range ecoregion and all of the species that are closely associated with those habitat types, and did a hierarchical clustering analysis to group those species habitat associations into 8 distinct groups. We chose the number of groups based on the desired number of species for the Coast Range ecoregion overall. We're hoping to eventually end up with about 8 species to represent that ecoregion. So we clustered into 8 different groups. We then went through a filtering process to remove poor candidates. These are things like non-native species, species that don't occur in the Coast Range, marine mammals, and migratory birds that don't breed within Oregon, that might just be using the habitat as a stepping stone on their migratory pathways. The next step in the process, which is what we need your help with, is the scoring. So we have a list of 43 candidate species for the Coast Range, and we're discussing the scoring process in detail here in the next few minutes. And we're essentially asking for your help in scoring these different candidates. A subset of the scoring is the addition of focal species. So we recognize that even though we want to represent different habitat types by focusing on these close habitat associations and these specialist species, it's still very important to consider the generalist species and species of particular social, economic, or conservation concern that might be lost as part of this clustering process. So we are adding back in focal species as we go along. We have a list of good candidate focal species or species of specific conservation concern that we have on the list right now, but we do encourage you, if you can think of others, to add those, and we'll point that out in the workbook when we go through that. Next, after the scoring is completed, we will go through and add in pertinent information about, say, species special status, and then we will rank based on your scores species within each of these habitat associations. And then finally, we'll hold a workshop. That's going to be on December 7th, and we'll discuss that at the end of the webinar today, to discuss the rankings and to finalize the selection of around 8 candidates to represent the Coast Range in the statewide assessment and the NPLCC's LCD project. All right, so to the scoring. So we're going to do scoring as part of a Google workbook. So we're going to do scoring as part of a Google workbook. We will send a link out to this workbook right after the completion of this webinar, so you'll all have access to it. You'll see here there's a variety of tabs here on the bottom of the workbook. The first one is a README, and it basically provides some course information about the workbook as a whole. Just some general information and instructions just to sort of give you some reminders as you go through this process. There's color coding throughout the workbook that represents different taxa, with amphibians and reptiles in green, birds in yellow, and mammals in an orange. And there's a tab here along the bottom for each of our habitat associations. So we have conifer hardwood forests, open water, riparian, and wetlands, bays, estuaries, coastal dunes, and headlands, montane mixed conifer forest, and alpine grassland and shrubland. And then, as I mentioned before, we have this tab for generalist and focal species, where we've listed Pacific martin, black-tailed deer, Roosevelt elk, black bear, and mountain lion as good potential candidates as focal species to add into the process. So we thought one of the easiest things that we could do to sort of give folks an overview of how we see scoring being the most successful is to walk through an example. So Leslie's done quite a bit of work with red-legged frog, which is a candidate here for the conifer hardwood forests habitat association. So we'll just go ahead and walk through the process. The first thing that we'd like you to do if you're scoring a species is to add a row underneath that species, and then add your name to the column C, which is the taxa or reviewer name column. Which is not showing up here now. Okay, yeah, great. So add your name to the taxa reviewer name column, and then just sort of we have this range of criteria in columns D through R. And so the first criteria here is whether or not the species is threatened by land clearing or vegetation removal. And you'll note that if you hover over the column headers, There are notes for each column header to sort of guide your scoring process. So for this criteria, examples include alienation due to lack of security cover, conversion to in-hospital environment, alienation due to lack of forage or prey, increases in competing species, predators, invasives, or exotics. I will note briefly here again that the formation of a lot of these criteria in this workbook draw pretty heavily on the work that was done by the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group. So we appreciate them sort of being forerunners in this effort.
Blazing the trail. So as I'm considering how red-legged frogs fit in being threatened by land clearing and vegetation removal, they're a small-bodied species. Their impulse in general is to hunker down when they're in their terrestrial phase, and so I would definitely say that species is threatened by land clearing or vegetation removal. So I would respond yes to that particular category as a yes or no.
Okay. So moving on to the next criterion, we have threatened by development. Again, if you hover over, there's some notes. So examples include barriers to movement created by fences, walls, buildings, asphalt, canals, alienation due to noise, lighting, lack of forage or prey, increases in competing species, predators, and invasive exotics, reduced accessibility of important habitat areas.
Yes, so again, in consideration of the red-legged frog, I would answer yes to them being threatened by development, being small-bodied, and needing good connections.
All right, so the next criteria, threatened by roads or traffic. Examples include creation of inhospitable conditions, creation of a physical barrier, fatal attraction, increased mortality due to vehicle collisions, behavioral alienation.
So it takes them a while to get across the road. and they're, as we know from the example of the Highway 30 project and others, they're definitely threatened by roads and traffic. So we would answer yes to that category as well for frogs.
All right, next criteria, threatened by people or domestic animals. Again, another yes or no. So examples would include legal and illegal harvest, harassment, disturbance, disease transmission, or intolerance.
So in general, red-legged frogs are not threatened by people or domestic animals, unusually so. I think there's kind of a normal amount of threat there, but I would say no.
All right, the next criteria, the next few are on a sliding scale from 1 to 10, where 1 represents the low end of the spectrum and 10 represents high. So for climate sensitivity, a rank of 1 would indicate the lowest climate sensitivity and 10 the highest. With this category, consider how specialized the species' habitat or niches, the species' sensitivity to temperature or precipitation changes, whether the species' reproductive rates are generally low, if the species depends on a sensitive habitat type, if the species' latitudinal range limit falls within the coast range, or if the species is endemic to the coast range.
Now, I personally feel like I would need to do a little more research to give a score to the climate sensitivity for red-legged frogs. So I actually am going to skip that particular column because I feel like I don't have the expertise to actually rank that right now, and that's totally fine.
That's totally okay.
Yeah.
It's not necessary to fill in all cells if you lack information about a specific criterion. So feel free to leave some blanks. Moving on, susceptibility to barriers. So again here, a rank of 1 would represent the lowest susceptibility, while a rank of 10 represents the highest.
Mobility.
Oh, sorry. Mobility. I skipped. Rank of 1 represents the lowest possible mobility, while rank of 10 represents the highest.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. So again, red-legged frogs can book it when they want to, but overall, in the range of all these critters, I would rank their mobility closer to a 3.
Susceptibility to barriers, the same, low versus high susceptibility.
Mm-hmm. And you have the details on that. They are, I've got them as an 8, so while they are susceptible to barriers in general, they can move pretty well through most of what's listed there.
Type of barrier sensitivity. So if the wildlife is sensitive to barriers, what sort of barriers are we talking about? Are we talking about canopy gaps over a certain size? Are we talking of waddies of water above a certain size, depth or flow rate, a specific type of fencing, roads that are greater than a different size or have a particularly high traffic volume? So what sort of barriers are we talking about?
So this species in particular is going to be sensitive to roads, both exposure and desiccation risk as well as collision risk. They're also sensitive to high curbs and Jersey barriers. Those would prevent them from moving. So I put a little more detail on that one.
The next two criteria are both to do with specific habitat structural characteristics that we've identified as being particularly important to the Coast Range. Column L here is whether or not the species is representative of an aquatic or terrestrial linkage. So does the species depend on both aquatic and terrestrial habitats to fulfill its life history needs?
So red-legged frogs are pond-breeding amphibians, and they actually spend most of their adult time at terrestrial, and so they definitely represent a connection between those two habitat types.
Okay. And then column M, does the species have an association with a specific sterile stage, and which stage, if so?
So no.
No for red-legged frogs. Moving on, does the species have an association with another structural habitat component with a particular emphasis on components that might be able to be mapped at the regional scale? So we definitely expect some of these species to have association with structural habitat components like a duff layer of a certain depth or perhaps, say, snags. But those are things that we don't have spatial data to map.
So, so red-legged frogs definitely need a good presence of that duff layer and sufficient moist microhabitats to facilitate their movement on the landscape. So we are putting that in there.
All right. Column O, particular socioeconomic consideration. So, for example, is the species considered a pest? Is the species culturally important? Is the species economically important?
Nothing particularly noteworthy about them, although they are pretty cool.
Column P, this is an important one. Data availability. Is there enough information on the species to support modeling efforts? Do we know enough about conditions that promote or deter movement? Or are the species' movement choices based on features that can be modeled?
So for the red-legged frog, we do have some telemetry data available, and we have more studies actually planned for winter 2019 coming up here. So I've made note of both of those things in that cell.
Great. Column Q, does the species represent other species? So would the species' habitat requirements and movement be representative of a broader group of species? If so, what other species might this candidate represent?
So just immediately, we can say that the red-legged frog definitely can help model for other species of pond-breeding amphibians. So we'll make a note of that there. And there may be others that we might be able to add with additional consideration. But
right. The final column here is just for comments and literature citations. So if you know of any publications that detail the species habitat or movement requirements, if you have any other comments that you think are important to take into consideration for that particular species that aren't being captured by these other criteria, column R would be the place for that.
I'll also mention that if you feel like you would like to note your confidence in any one of those particular categories, if you'd like to make an assertion as to what you think it is, but note that it's a high or low confidence that you have, that's also totally welcome information.
Yeah, and that's the whole process. We don't anticipate this being a super time-intensive process. We ask that you score species for which you have information. So we realize that there's 43 candidates here. We are not asking you to score all 43. It's really just if you have information about these species, we welcome you to provide scoring for those. And again, it's not necessary to fill in all the cells if you lack information about a specific criterion. More than one individual is welcome to provide scores for the same species. So, for example, if someone else on the phone also has worked with red-legged we wants to provide scoring, we would just ask that you insert another row below Leslie's information, put your name in the taxa or reviewer name column, and then fill out the scoring. And that goes for, the rest of the species. It's fine to have multiple scores for the species, and then we'll take that information and average it in advance of a workshop. Once the scoring is completed, we will go back and we'll add in objective criteria. So there's other things that we're going to want to take into consideration about these species, but it's not necessarily important for scoring. So things like species, state, and federal status, those are objective things that aren't going to change. We'll go back in and add those after the scoring is done. I think now would be a good time to take any questions about the scoring process if folks on the phone want to chime in and ask a few things.
Hi, Rachel. This is Shrishti from Defenders.
Hey, Shrishti.
Hi. Just a quick question, and I'm sorry I joined like 10 minutes late, so you might have mentioned it. But for ranking this, and I know that similar efforts were done in Washington, will the results or the scores or the species that were already selected in Washington be reflected in this sheet if there's an overlap already, or will that be a step afterwards?
For the Washington coastal process, they are also going through their species selection process right now, kind of simultaneously with us. So they have not selected species yet. We have not selected species yet. We do hope to sort of compare our candidate list so that there's as much continuity between the two states as possible.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions about the scoring process? All right. Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Hopefully, you all can provide some information and help us out here. Go back to our slideshow. We ask that you complete scoring for any species for which you have information by no later than Friday, November 30th. We were hoping to give folks about 3 weeks to score candidates, but we know we're going to run into Thanksgiving week and folks are going to be traveling and having family around. So we'll push it out to Friday, November 5th, and I'll send out a reminder along the way. Also, please feel free to forward the link to the workbook to other folks within your organization that you think might have some of this information and might want to participate. We know that this webinar is definitely not going to capture everybody that might be interested, so please feel free to distribute it more broadly. So the next step in this process after the scoring is done, we'll go through and do the ranking, and then we are going to have a workshop to finalize species selection for the Coast Range on Friday, December 7th from 9:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. in Newport, Oregon. We will have a teleconference option available for folks that can't make it out to Newport, but for folks that can, we'll have a meeting room available. I have the information on the location for that, and I will send those details in the follow-up email that also has a link to the workbook that we'll send right after this webinar is over. So we definitely hope that you're willing to participate here and help us out, that you can help us score candidates, and that you can join us for this in-person workshop to discuss the rankings and to finalize our species selection for the Coast Range. If you have any questions at all about the statewide connectivity assessment and mapping project, if you have any questions about the species selection project process for the LCD project, or the scoring, the Google workbook, anything that we've discussed here today, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at rachel.e.wheat@state.or.us. And then my phone number is there, and then I'm available to take questions pretty much at any time, and I'd be happy to chat through any questions or concerns you might have. And that's it. Yeah, go forth and score. I'll send the link to the workbook within the next few minutes out to folks. And again, please feel free to forward to other people within your organization you think might want to participate, and let me know if you have any questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Wow.